Hello and welcome to From Intent to Impact, a Products Change podcast, and to this episode, Rewriting the Rules of Industry. Over the last 5 years, the brand licensing retail industry has been on one of the most significant transformational journeys in its history to reduce its environmental impact. What was once a niche conversation, which I know we're going to dig into a little bit later, is now actually central to how some businesses design, source, manufacture, and grow. This podcast is all about capturing that journey, honestly and openly, and actually from the people who have helped to shape it, looking at what's worked, what hasn't, and what's it going to take to build the future of our industry. Now, at POC, our focus has always been to connect industry, to simplify sustainability and build and connect to infrastructure that already exists to make real change. Because the reality is that no one business can do this on their own. And increasingly, the challenge isn't even intent, it's actually alignment, simplification, and building those enabling conditions that will enable us to build that better future. And that's why today's conversation is so important. Now, at this point, I'd usually talk about our podcast sponsor, Worldly, but today is a little bit different as we've actually got them here talking to us, which I'm so excited about. And actually, this conversation is actually happening also on Sir David Attenborough's 100th birthday. So happy birthday to Sir David. And actually, that's why this conversation is even more important. And I'm just really excited to get into the conversation. What's going to be a chat of two halves, actually. Now, I would be lying if I said I wasn't in awe of one of our guests today. He's a true pioneer, an award-winning explorer. He was talking about circularity way before many of us even knew it was a thing. He co-founded the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. He led the environmental affairs team and the public engagement team at Patagonia for over 15 years and was part of the first American team to summit K2, one of the hardest mountains in the world to climb. Really easy for me to roll these achievements off here, but they are a culmination of a lifetime of experience, hard work, dedication, and actually a huge amount of sacrifice. And I'm just so pleased and very honoured to have the amazing Rick Ridgeway with us here today. Hello, Rick.
Well, hello, Helena. Pleasure to be here with you and my colleague Jay from Worldly.
Jay, we're going to get to you as well. As we said, it's not just me and Rick on our own. Jay is here with us. Jay is the Chief Marketing Officer at Worldly. And I know, Jay, we're going to dig into that a little bit more because it's not just about marketing. It's about supplier engagement. And you're working really closely with the team there. And we know that's your day job, but also you are an amazing storyteller too. So I'd love to dig into that a little bit for our listeners today. You were the executive producer for Silver's Love, which was actually nominated for Outstanding Television Movie at the 2021 Primetime Emmy Awards. And I know that there's a lot more accolades with the content that you created there too. So thank you so much for joining us as well today, Jay.
Great to be here. Thank you, Helena.
Now, I'd really like to start at the very beginning. Jay, chip in where you want to, but I think we'll start with Rick, if that's okay. Rick, I've got your book here, one of your books here. You've penned many books and you've been on many amazing expeditions for lots of wonderful companies. One of them, National Geographic, which I know inspired you in your very early years. And actually inspired me. That's the whole reason why I'm on this sustainability journey, as I corporately went to work for National Geographic 10 years ago and started to see, started to learn about the planet and the environment. And I was there to drive a commercial role and ended up starting Products to Change from that commercial role to see how we start to produce products differently from my time at Nat Geo. So when I started reading your book, I was like, they inspired me too, but in a very different way. You're inspired to climb mountains. I changed my career. But what I'd love to do is kind of go to those very early days, Rick, because you've pushed yourself so much throughout your career across so many different things. But actually, I'd love to kind of start at the very beginning, kind of what inspired young Rick to go on this journey of exploration.
Well, thank you, Helena. And I didn't know it was David Attenborough's 100th birthday today. Oh my goodness!
Mm-hmm.
And that's that's what a terrific framing for our conversation, because as we all know, he has brought so much to all of our lives, helping us really not just understand, but emotionally connect to the magic of nature, to the magic of the wild parts of our one and only home planet. And that connection to nature is actually where my own story starts. And I personally owe so much to him. What a true mentor and guide he's been for all of us. So a special day. And you probably know this from reading my book, but in there I told the story about how even as a boy growing up in Southern California, I had this connection to nature that was just instinctual, that I spent as much time as I could out in whatever rural areas near my home out on the outskirts of Los Angeles that I could find time for. And as part of that passion, my mother had given me a subscription to National Geographic. So another thing among many apparently we have in common. And so I was about 14 years old when I received the issue in the early 1960s of National Geographic with the cover story of the first American ascent of Mount Everest. And there was a photograph of Jim Whittaker, the first American to climb Everest, on the summit, holding his ice axe up above his head with the two flags of the United States and the National Geographic Society tied to the shaft handle, and the oxygen mask on his face, the wind blowing. And I saw that and I just said, I want to be that guy. That's who I want to be. I just knew it. And it took, I found some buddies in high school to go up into the mountains above Los Angeles with me and try to teach ourselves how to climb. We went to finally found a store where we could buy ice axe and crampons, and my mother's maternal radar started to buzz loudly because, she could just see her son prematurely dying on some ice slope trying to teach himself how to climb. So as a graduation present, she sent me to Outward Bound, which, had its origins and roots in New England, as you know. And that was transformational. I just knew that's what I wanted to do, and that became my path. So fast forward about a little over maybe 12 or 14 years later, I had gotten good enough as a mountaineer that I was invited on what became the first American ascent of K2, the second highest mountain in the world, but now recognized far and away as the hardest mountain to climb. Mm-hmm. And back then, it's a really good thing we didn't know that. This was in the late 70s. If somebody told me it was the hardest mountain in the world, I would have been so frightened I probably never would have been able to climb it. But the leader of that expedition was none other than Jim Whittaker, my boyhood hero, the guy whose photograph on the first American ascent of Everest got my juices going, fired my passion. And now I was on an expedition with him, which seems so magical. And then again, I write this in that book that you just read, Life Lived Wild, but I stayed after it. And years later, after that, I was invited on what was the first wall climb ever done in Antarctica. We ascended this giant rock wall, 2,000 vertical feet. In fact, it was more than vertical, actually overhung the whole way.
Wow.
In the middle of that climb, we got into this big storm, came in, and we had to rappel down and wait at our little base camp for the weather to break. And while we were there, one of the climbers on the expedition, Conrad Anker, at that time considered the greatest alpine climber in the world, said, Rick, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. When I was about 12 or 13 or 14, I got National Geographic in the mail, and you were on the cover making your ascent of K2. And I said, that's who I want to be. And I've got you to thank for being here. And then we got home from that expedition, and Conrad was on the cover of National Geographic. And so I called him up and I said, "Hey, I just got my magazine in the mail. Congratulations, cover boy. You know what's going to happen, don't you?" And he goes, "Yeah, but tell me anyway." I said, "That's right. There's a young 12 or 13 or 14-year-old girl or boy out there getting their magazine in the mail. And that's what's going to happen." So it's been about passing the baton. It's been about passion. But let's go back to David Attenborough, to Sir David, because more than anything, it's been that connection to nature and the wild part of our world. And that connection ultimately to why all of us in business need to protect the health of our one and only home planet. Because and we can come back to this later, but let's just frame it right now. As another one of my mentors, the great American environmentalist David Brower, said, "It's because there is no business on a dead planet." That has framed my whole professional career. My passion and connection to nature has framed my whole life, with my business career as a part of that. Okay.
And I think it's so important. And Rick, I think it's so important to recognize that internal compass, because I think as you go through your life and you go into business and opportunities might come your way, or you get older and you need some money and you got a family. I think, so many people that go throughout business or go through their life don't stay true to that internal, that compass that's part of them, that roots them to a purpose of how they want to live their life. And I think that's what you've done. You've really kept true to who you are on all these amazing adventures that you've gone on. Like you said, you limp back through to that.
Yeah, no, that has been a through line, and it's purpose connected with passion. There's no magic formula here. It's actually, those are the two elemental things. But purpose is so important, and having that internal compass is so important. And anybody listening here who's wondering if they have that themselves, well, that's the right question to ask. And when I go around speaking to high schools and colleges and young people now, I try to end my conversations with them, my presentations that I make, by reminding them that purpose is not about them. It's not about us. It's not about me. It's about how I can be more than just myself. It's how I can use whatever tools and skills I've got in my box to take those tools out and make our one and only home planet and the people on it better than when I left it. That has to be all of ours overarching purpose. If that purpose connected with passion is going to allow us to lead a truly full life, fulfilled life.
Totally. And I wonder if you having that purpose from being part of the mountaineering sporting background that you're from, if we think of your do buddies, your do boys, the people that you kind of grew up with that went out and created, the North Face, Esprit, Patagonia, and here you are as this group of men with a purpose to do things differently, to go out in the world of business, but to stay true to who you are. And I think that's what's made the businesses that have come from that be really special. And I think that's why they're still around today. And they're not even just in mountaineering. They are brands driving this voice and this change more than just in mountaineering, but in fashion and across content. It's quite amazing how I think when you stay true to that, great things can happen.
Well, you refer to a little band of friends and often for me mentors that we called ourselves the Do Boys, and later on we finally managed to wake up and add a few Do Girls to the mix too. Took a little while, but mentors, that's all such an important part of all of our lives too, and I think all of us, especially we who are older, I'm 76 years old now, But looking back, without those mentors, the path wouldn't have been the same for me. And that's, I think I can probably safely say that's going to be true for anybody listening. And I've also, looking back at my own life and paying attention to this topic of mentors, I've discovered that in your late 20s and early 30s is probably the time in our lives when we most need guides. When we have that point in our life where we're going from our learning and our school years into the professional parts of our lives, and having people guide us and show us different paths and different opportunities is so essential at that stage of our lives. And you've mentioned it already, how lucky I was to have two people, especially who were initially climbing partners uh, in my life at that same stage. They were 7 and 10 years older than me, respectively, and that was Doug Tompkins and Yvonne Chouinard. And I met them in my 20s, uh, as I said a minute ago, eventually or originally as climbing partners. But then they were both very successful businessmen, although their careers were emerging in those years when we were climbing together. Um, Doug was a high school dropout. He never got past the 10th grade. School just bored him, and he became a ski. He got into skiing, and he became a ski racer, and that took over everything. And then he ended up in California, and he met some rock climbers. So he took up rock climbing, and he moved to Yosemite, and he lived in the climbers camp where he met Yvonne Chouinard, who was just a couple years older than him, and another dropout, climbing bum. But Doug was of all of them, Doug was probably the most instinctual entrepreneur. So the first thing he did when he got to Yosemite, not just finding climbing partners like Yvonne and others to help him learn how to rock climb, he buys the local hot dog stand in Yosemite. He scraped up enough money to buy the hot dog stand and turned it into a successful business. So, he was probably 18 or 19 or 20 years old. And he became a world-class climber. And so he and Yvonne and his buddies couldn't really afford good climbing gear. It was the best climbing gear was coming out of your country in England, and it was expensive. It was imported, so he started making packs and parkas and sleeping bags for his buddies and himself, and he decided to call that little startup the North Face. And then Yvonne was making pitons and the spikes you drive in rocks, and then the carabiner clips that you fasten the spikes to your rope with. And he was selling that to his climbing buddies, and he called that Chouinard equipment. And then pretty soon he started importing rugby shirts from Scotland because they were so rugged, they made great shirts for rock climbing. And then those started out selling the pitons, and he had this epiphany that not very many people needed pitons and carabiners, but there was a lot more that could probably value from durable clothing, even if more than just rock climbing. So the clothes started out selling the pitons, and he decided to name that part of his business Patagonia, because he and Doug Tompkins had just got back from a climb in Patagonia where they made an incredible ascent of this rock spire down there, and he loved the wildness of it. So he named it Patagonia to capture that sense of wildness and wild nature, what it meant to him and to Doug and the rest of these guys. So I came along, and again, I was the pup. For the first half of my life, I was always the youngest kid on the trips. And now in the last part of my life, I'm the oldest guy. I don't think there was any transition in the middle. I don't remember that. I just went directly from being the youngest to the oldest. I don't know how that happened. But along the way, these two guys really inspired me, as that's where I learned my most foundational lessons as a business person, some of my really important lessons as a climber, um, some of the ways I've learned from the climbing and time in the mountains to that those foundational values that informed my life and business. We can get into that in a little bit. But most importantly, and I learned this especially from Doug Tompkins, was how all of us in business were morally obligated to use our businesses as best we could to protect our one and only home planet, because that's exactly what they did. That was the foundational value of the Du Bois, our little posse of outdoor climbers and adventurers who were also business people.
And evangelists within the world of business, doing things differently. And I love that because I wish that more businesses would have that as their core, and we know that we're trying to get them to do more. And actually, I read Yvonne's book, Let My People Go Surfing, in 2019 when I started my own journey into sustainability. It was actually the first book that I read that kind of inspired me while I was still at Nat Geo to kind of say, businesses should be doing things a bit differently. So I wonder, Ricky, if you'd mind, we kind of switch from your amazing climbing career and being at the early stages with your buddies of them, being that bit older than you, starting these businesses, and then you coming on that journey and really driving impact. How did you end up at Patagonia? Like, how did that happen? I don't know the story of that.
Yeah, well, another thing I had learned from Yvonne and Doug and a few others of our friends was how their passion for climbing and just being in the wild parts of the world, it not only informed their business lives, but it catalyzed it, because they all of them were trying to figure out, well, how can I make some money out of climbing and mountaineering and the sport part of it. So I had to do the same thing. And then my path was, initially anyway, was more through the marketing end of it, because I had a skill as a storyteller. I recognized that people on our trips always appreciated my ability to, sit in a tent during a snowstorm and tell stories that were amusing. And like, I learned how to do that. So, I learned early on that marketing, as we all know, is essentially storytelling. So I thought, there's the connection. So I did. I developed skills in business marketing, and that led to getting jobs with outdoor companies in marketing. I worked with the Celtic Pack Company I had a 20-year run with them as a retained consultant, helping shape their storytelling and their marketing, and with other outdoor companies. And that included Yvonne's company, Patagonia. So I was doing marketing work with them, and then I got married also in my early 30s, that great transition period in our lives. Again, that was inspired by one of my climbing partners who had married early and then had ultimately a big family of 4 kids, and he was a terrific father. So I wanted to be him as well. Like, I figured he was doing it all. Yvonne got married. He had 2 kids. Doug, they had families and they were doing this. So I did that too. And then, of course, I had to support the family, but not just me, my wife. So she met Yvonne, and then he hired her. She had some experience in the apparel industry, but in fashion. She worked for Calvin Klein when we got married. She was like employee number 6, I think. It was when it was a startup. She'd been there since the beginning. And she had a good instinct for marketing. So she and Yvonne, my wife Jennifer Ridgeway, they co-founded the marketing department at Patagonia, and the 2 of them invented what became the Patagonia catalog. Like, they figured it all out. And she, she died a few years ago of cancer at too early of an age. But I was so honored when magazines like Outside and many blogs and interviews and obituaries and articles about her, credited her and Yvonne with defining what authenticity in marketing means. They figured it out, that they knew how to tell a story that had no element of bullshit. Like they knew how to be so honest that the customers just instinctually picked up on that honesty. And that was their contribution, not just to Patagonia, but to marketing and advertising. It was super foundational. I don't know that people really appreciate how much influence in storytelling, in business storytelling and marketing that those early Patagonia catalogs in the very early 1980s had. And we still see that today. It still resonates. So she had a wonderful 20-year run there. And then she retired. I had my own business. I had a company that marketed what today we call content, photographs and video clips and film, mostly about nature and the outdoors, to the advertising industry. So it was a small business, but a very successful, and had 20 some employees. And we had this humming little business. And I was able to sell it in the late 90s, early aughts, right when everything was digitizing. It was like perfect timing, because I got a really high valuation. And I knew that I either had to recapitalize to digitize or, pivot. And I pivoted. And it was successful. It really worked out. But there I was, I had to redefine my business life again. And I got an offer from Patagonia to go to work for them. My wife had left the company by that point. And I got an offer to come into marketing, but also, more interestingly, to come in and guide their environmental initiatives and their sustainability. And I was wrestling whether to do that because, I had a couple of cautions. There was a couple of flags there I had to pay attention to. One was that my buddy Yvonne owned the company. And I did, as one of my closest friends, did I want to set myself up for potential conflict with him? What if I went one way and he was going another? And I didn't. I'm not the kind of guy who just goes his way because he owns the company. Like I could, but he knew that, so we talked about it. The other flag was that I'd never worked for anybody. Like I had always been self-employed. I always had my own company. And so I was wrestling with that. And one day my wife, Jennifer, said, Rick, you're always telling me that you like to try new stuff, that you go out and do stuff you've never done before. So how about this thing called having a regular job? And so that was the nudge that I needed. And so in the early aughts, I think it was 2004, I started Patagonia with what became a great 15-year run. I think it worked for them and me. It was really cool. And it turned out that running marketing and environmental initiatives and sustainability was too much for me. I didn't have the management skills to do all those things. So I ended up with environmental initiatives and eventually, before I left the company, another pivot to what we call public engagement with all our stakeholders, because it turned out I was pretty good at that. But the environmental initiatives and sustainability were my main focus. And I didn't know anything about sustainability. I really hadn't had exposure to managing a supply chain or the environmental component of the supply chain. And then eventually, this wasn't really my responsibility, but the social justice component of that management as well. And I had to learn really fast. But I was a pretty quick learner. So after being on it for a couple of years, I was starting to understand it. And I was understanding a couple of what turned out to be sort of important insights. And maybe the biggest one of all, and this frames up what we're here to talk about, I think, was how there was a really need for reliable measurement of this impact of the supply chain, both its environmental impact and its social justice commitments. And it didn't exist. So we started working early in my run at Patagonia. We were working with our outdoor trade association in the United States, the Outdoor Industry Alliance. And with a bunch of other companies in that alliance, we had developed a measurement tool to measure mostly in tier one, the environmental footprint of factories in our supply chains. And it was pretty robust. And at the same time, concurrent with that, another friend of mine who was one of the Du Bois, a guy named Jib Ellison, a good friend of Yvonne and Doug's and the rest of us, an outdoor adventure buddy, he had a sustainability consultancy he'd started, and his first client was Walmart. And he's the guy that really got Walmart on their sustainability path. You know, if you want another interview sometime with a guy that's really made a lot of influence that not that many people understand, Jib, you ought to get Jib on your podcast here, Helena, because you'll hear a lot of the same stories. That's the downside because we've done so much stuff together. But he got a hold of me. He truly is the guy who got Walmart started on their sustainability. And he called me one day and he says, listen, we need help. I want to get these guys to use organically grown cotton, and you guys are the leaders. So, I went to Yvonne and I went to some of the executives in the company, told them, I want to help Walmart out with environmental cotton. And at the time, that was Patagonia's main differentiator in the marketplace, 100% organically grown cotton, And they go, you what? You want to get the biggest company in the world at that time to use our differentiator? I go, yeah, it's going to scale organically grown cotton. And they go, wait a minute, what am I missing here? And I said, what you're missing is why we're in business. We would have those kind of conversations there. It was really, I love that part of that company. So everybody got into alignment. Walmart came out. We helped them. They started using organically grown cotton in their private label, especially beginning with the Kits line. And then they said, hey, we got this scorecard we're developing for our suppliers. Can you help us with that? And I did. And it was this simple, I think it had 15 questions on it, scorecard. And so we got that done. And they were so thankful. They came out to Ventura, where Patagonia is headquartered in California. And just to finally meet everybody, because we've been doing a lot of this stuff by phone and whatnot, and not that much in person. And then at the end of that meeting, one of their top executives said, Rick, it's been so cool. This partnership really means a lot to us. Is there anything else we could do together? And I had not even thought about it, but I thought of that scorecard, and I thought of the work that the Outdoor Industry Alliance was doing. And instead of telling them, what if you, instead of this simple scorecard, what if you use this really robust tool that we've been developing with our companies in the outdoor industry? I didn't say that because I had enough sense to know they got to go on a journey here. If this is going to work, they got to discover that themselves. It's got to be their conclusion, not my suggestion, because, it wouldn't work otherwise. And I said, what if so I just said, listen, what if we join forces? Walmart and Patagonia, we get together and let's pick a number, 10 other companies in, and we'll start our own alliance and we'll build a really robust scorecard. Like a really robust one, and it'll be uniform, and it'll be used by this little dirtbag, scrappy company that's a leader, and the world's biggest company, and these other companies, it'll immediately standardize because of your size. If we have just a dozen other companies, so they go, and I said, listen, we'll code name it David and Goliath, and they said, okay, we got to talk about it. So they went out and chatted for a while. They came back into the room and they go, okay, we're going to do it with one condition. And I go, oh God, here it goes south before it can go north. I thought margins, what kind of condition is Walmart going to request? And I've never been a cynic, but I was a little skeptical at that point because I was not naive. This is the biggest company in the world, public company. Patagonia is a private company, huge difference. Of course, a huge difference. So I was ready for whatever the condition was. And they said the condition is that you have to be Goliath and we're David. And I laughed and I said, whatever. And then we high-fived and shook hands. And that was how the Sustainable Apparel Coalition came to be. And within 2 years, we had 40 companies, and we had the beta version of what became the Higg Index. And it has continued to scale. That's why we're talking to each other right now.
And I absolutely love that. And I guess, in those early days, was it? Because if I think of POC in the work that we do, it's like you're going around with your cap and you're saying, we want to do this piece of work and it's better for the whole industry. And if you all put a little bit of money in the hat, we can build X, Y, and Z. I guess it was the same with you, Rick. It's just like, well, it's going to cost X to do this work. Does everybody kind of just pop some money in the pot and you divide it between you?
Well, it was a lot of hard work. And it required a lot. It was like starting a business where you put together your pitch and then you do your road show. And that's what I had to do. I had to go on the road and I had to meet. I remember going into Levi's office and, sitting down with their management and giving them the whole pitch. And then the one guy, Michael Kabori, I remember, he became a close friend, but he looks right at me and he goes, why? And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, why should I do this instead of all the other 50 things that are on my plate right now as head of sustainability at Levi's? Tell me why. And I had to sit back and I go, Michael, that is a totally valid question. You got to the heart of it. So it made me think through why we all needed this. And it laddered up to where we started our conversation. It laddered up to being able to argue why anybody in business depends on a healthy planet with healthy people. It made me stop and realize and think through how to make the argument to everybody what I had assumed should be so obvious, that without that healthy planet, there are no healthy resources to support our businesses. And without those healthy resources to support healthy businesses that need a healthy planet, there is no planet to support healthy societies. And without healthy societies, you can't have healthy markets. And so I had to learn how to articulate these connections between healthy business and healthy planet at kind of a high level, and then go down from there. And as I went down, you get to the foundational principle that you can't really manage things very well without good measurement. And that what we all needed was an understanding of what the baseline was in our supply chains that we're working with. We needed to really understand what our true impact and footprint was, because without that understanding, there was no way to really know where to begin our management. So as I started to build this argument, we got companies on board. Michael finally said, okay, I get it, I'm in, and Levi's became one of the foundational companies. And the hardest companies of all to get on board were the leaders, because Nike was probably even better than Patagonia in having its own measurement tools and having its own sustainability programs and management of the supply chain, including social and labor, after they got beat up really badly in the 90s. And they had come back with the leading programs in the whole apparel and footwear industry to manage those impacts. And they go, why do we need you? We got our own program. So they were a really hard sell. But eventually we got them on board too. And I'll always remember 2 or 3 years after we'd started this, we started off focusing on environmental impact. And we're in some meeting. It was in Seattle, looking out over the bay. I think REI was our host, the Recreational Equipment Incorporated. And the representative from Nike gets up because we were having this existential argument about needing to expand our focus from just environmental impact to social justice. It had to be both things. It had to be people. It had to be people and planet. You can't separate the two. And I was making that argument. And the leader from Nike gets up and looks at everybody, because there were all these people that were worried about the social labor part, because companies like Nike were so entrenched in that that there were so many, the whole ecosystem was so fragmented that the challenge of bringing it in together, of standardizing the fragmentation, was way gnarlier than the environmental impact part of it. And so there was some hesitancy there, and it was understandable. Like, let's get one thing done before we do another. And I'm going, no, we got to do it all concurrently. You're crazy, And Nike gets up and says, we have to do it together. We have to do it together because of planet and people. And they articulated this vision of how everything works together. And then they said, and furthermore, if the rest of you don't do this, we're leaving today, and this whole thing's going to fall apart. And everybody went quiet. And then everybody raised their hand and said, okay, we're in. We'll do this. So there were these existential moments, so many of them. And there always, probably almost always is in any startup, but we got through them, we got past them. And I remember, having to many, many times pause and take my breath and find that reset, that energy to go, okay, let's keep going here. And I often realized I would go back to that last day on K2, trying to climb the second highest mountain in the world and make that first ascent without oxygen, when nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever climbed that mountain without oxygen. It was only the third time it had ever been climbed by anybody. We did a new route that nobody in the 50 or 60 years since then has ever repeated. And that last day without oxygen was so hard, and I didn't know I could do it. But I mined the resources down deep. I found the way to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And I went back to that. That was my yardstick. And I would say, dude, you did that. You're going to do this. It doesn't even compare. Like, don't go feeling sorry. Just roll up your sleeves and get the job done. So I found my own resources, my own, things I'd learned from Yvonne and Doug about why I was doing this. And we kept going, and we made it work. We never, you just never take no for an answer. And those early years were, when I think back to it too, I realized that, it was a success because it was so collaborative, because, we had this multi-stakeholder alliance. We had all the players at the table. We had the suppliers there working with the brands and the retailers, working with the universities and the academics and the NGOs. We had the Natural Resources Defense Council, who was the main one beating everybody up, especially over the chemical impact of their supply chains back when we started this thing. So we asked the NRDC to write the initial chemistry framework for the Higg Index. And they did.
Amazing.
So that became such a source of strength. And then we had these foundational principles at the beginning that Walmart brought in. God, they were so good. Like they said, okay, Rick, the foundational principle has to be to always build on existing work. We've got already got everybody lined up on that, because you were clever not to tell us about this OIA tool that you had been working to develop. But, we're starting with that. We get it. We'll always build on existing work. will never let perfection get in the way good enough. We got to move fast. It's never going to be perfect. It's going to be good enough to take the next step.
Yeah.
A foundational principle. So with those things, we really were able to move forward pretty fast. We within 2 or 3 years became the biggest trade organization in apparel and footwear. And then in those foundational years, we did some pretty cool things. Looking back on it, made a big difference. And one of the coolest things we did, Nike again was a big influence here. They connected us with this team of thinkers and analysts at MIT in America, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And these were this little group of deep thinkers specializing in how to analyze complex systems and identify how to change them in a predefined direction. Like, that's what they did. So we hired these guys to analyze the whole apparel ecosystem, to analyze how the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and Higg could fit into it, what the ultimate goals were, and what the levers were that you wanted to pull to get to those goals. And they called it, and they made this thing they called it the systems map of the apparel industry, with Higg right in the middle. And it allowed all of us to align on what those levers and that we were going to pull, what we needed to do and why we needed to do it. And even remind us all where we were heading at the end of the day. And we all started to realize that where we were heading, we started to realize that the world that we envisioned was one where, through deep measurement that had verified data that was transparent and reliable, that with that data, year over year, the industry could show annual decrease in environmental impact and annual increase in social justice. Like, that was the goal. And then they said, they analyzed all the external stakeholders, especially the policymakers. And they came into this analysis and they said, at the end of the day, you're never going to do it with apparel and footwear. You're only going to do it by leveraging consumer goods, because that is where a huge part of the impact on planet and people come, especially to fight climate change, because that was emerging back then. This was 2013 and 14 as another existential threat. And that you've got to leverage your measurement tools, which were by then branded Higg, to all categories of consumer goods to get this, to realize your vision. So we all aligned on that back then. And so now, here we are these years later, a decade plus, and with the Higg company making the tools, now rebranded as Worldly on purpose, and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition rebranded 3 years ago for whatever it was, J4 or 5, on purpose as Cascale, Collective Action at Scale, rebranded so that the two together can expand to other categories of consumer goods, and that's happening right now. Yeah. It's underway. We're still on track. Yeah.
And just the companies that you brought on that journey, and I wonder, even Jay, if we bring you in here, just the volume of people that are using the tools that Rick so kindly has taken us through, how it all started, but the impact that the company has today. I mean, I'd love for you to run through some of those for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just have to say, Rick, I love listening to you talk. One of my favorite things about working at Worldly is I get to talk to Rick fairly regularly. So that's fantastic. And I should also mention that part of my origin story as a marketer, because my plan was to be an anthropologist. That's what I studied. I was going to live out of a tent. But I fell in love with a person who was clearly supposed to be my life partner. And she had different plans, didn't want to live in a tent. Her whole life, she has a love for nature. So I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I learned about an ad from Patagonia that Rick was involved with for a jacket that just said, "Do not buy this jacket." And it was anti-consumerism. And that was the first signal I got that marketing could be for good too. Because I had always thought, like, I was a bit of a radical growing up. I was very curious and passionate, but I was like, advertising is evil. Business is evil. And that ad was kind of the catalyst for me thinking differently and really getting into marketing, and always being focused on trying to do good through marketing. So thank you for that, Rick. And I won't get into my origin story around my love of nature, but Rick is also a bit of a catalyst for that.
Yeah, it's really important because I think that's that's your compass. A bit
Yeah,
like what you were saying, you got to think of, not everybody has that.
yeah,
People have a different compass. Some people it's about money, some people it's about what they can achieve themselves. But I think because of your love of nature, you have that compass that's part of you. So as then you go into industry, into marketing and business, you just come at it with just a totally different view.
exactly. That's exactly right. And my story is very different from Rick's, of course, but similar in the sense that when I was a teenager, I was going down a path that concerned my mother. It wasn't an adventuring path. It was a different kind of path that I was going down. And she sent me off to Knowles. Wasn't Outward Bound, but it was Knowles. And that experience, living in nature, literally transformed me in my life. And I went from being very uncomfortable to realizing it was the place where I was most comfortable. And, just spending over a month living that way just changed me. And then 2 years later, after I graduated high school, I spent a whole summer in Yosemite being a climbing bum. But I only spent the summer, but it was an amazing experience. And I've always stayed active. I'm in Colorado because of the mountains, and it's been a big part of my life and a big part of why I'm at Worldly. And you were asking about the impact of Worldly, and you know, again, without the work that Rick was describing that he did at Patagonia and with Walmart, we wouldn't exist. And the impact is massive. And that's part of, again, why I joined Worldly. And part of why the impact is massive is because a decision was made years ago to separate from the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And that might sound strange, but I think it's important because that decision was made to scale impact.
Mm.
And it was a very pragmatic decision. And Rick has spent a career, explaining that doing the right thing and doing the smart thing aren't necessarily opposed. And when that decision was made, it was because, the SAC at the time being a multi-stakeholder initiative, a convening body, a standard setter, and then a technology company on top of that just was not working out and was not the path to real scale and real impact. So the membership voted and made the decision that what was at the time Higg would spin out of the SAC. And again, that was a catalyst for a lot of this impact that I think happened because we were then able to form ourselves as a public benefit company, a for-profit public benefit company, but that enabled us to raise capital necessary to build the right technology and the right infrastructure. There's a lot of educational resources, especially for manufacturers and suppliers, a lot of support that has really enabled this to scale. And as Rick said, it's gone global. There are tens of thousands of factories every year that use the Higg Index, and it reduces their burden because it is a standard. They get to do one assessment, share it with many customers, and that's one of the things that excites me the most because that issue of assessment and audit fatigue is such a massive burden for suppliers and doesn't only impact their business, but it impacts their ability to do good work and improve and make impact. So, and now, as Rick said, we're expanding into many other categories. We've always had customers in other categories, but really deliberately now moving into outdoor sporting goods, home furnishings, all kinds of categories. And what's nice about it is it's a pretty easy expansion because we've proven the case.
Mm.
What's happened in the apparel and textile industries is amazing and really hasn't happened in many other industries. And it's because of the Higg Index. Yeah.
Totally agree. And I think that when I look at it as far as how we can be working with you here at POC, because we work with brand owners, many categories, toys, publishing, home, and there's, like you said, there's no standardization within that. And even the manufacturers that are squeezed in the middle, that work between a retailer and a brand owner. Retailers asking them for one thing, the brand owners are asking them for another. There's so much complexity that's coming down to these companies that we just need to simplify this, because if we simplify this, we can then make progress. But at the minute, for all those other categories, it's just not that easy for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult, and it's nice for them to have an example of where it's happened and where it's worked in apparel and textiles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then as far as kind of how you then move forward, so kind of what are the areas of industry that you're really focusing on now? So those that are listening, if they're in those industries, I know we're going to be putting some working groups together. You know, what are those ones that we're going to be focusing on together?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll start by saying, and Rick, you can back me up here. The Higg Index was designed to work for consumer goods broadly, right? And that is currently the case. One of the things that amazed me when I first joined Worldly, and I started visiting a lot of our manufacturer and supplier customers all over the world, was I came in under the assumption this is all about apparel and textiles and some footwear. I visited pen factories that have been doing FEM assessments and using the Higg Index for years, makeup factories, household cleaning goods factories that have been using it for years, all kinds of factories that have been using it for years, and of course, all kinds of brands and retailers as well. But our real focus, and again, we're focused on impact and adjacency where it makes the most sense. So outdoor sporting goods. A lot of our customers, like North Face, like Patagonia, are already in that space, so it's a natural expansion and makes sense. Home furnishings is a really big one for us as well. That's a space that has historically had a lot of challenges when it comes to environmental impact, but also social and labor practices as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to do good, but also represented an opportunity for us to move very deliberately into a space that included hard goods as well as textiles and materials that we had already been working with. So it was a natural expansion as well. And in addition to that, toys is another big focus for us. A lot of work to be done there as well. And eyeglasses and watches are also really big for us as well. So we're being focused and deliberate, but what's interesting is we're finding demand increasing across sectors and kind of coming to us because, again, the story is pretty well known. And what we find is we move into these sectors with Cascale, our partner Cascale, by the way, and we start talking to these new brands and retailers. They all know about the Higg Index.
Yeah.
And our only obstacle is their perception that, oh, isn't that just for apparel? And then we educate them a little bit. Nope, it's not. And it's working really well. And again, the most exciting part is the scaling the impact, right? In a way that makes sense for all players, not just the brands and retailers, but those manufacturers and suppliers too.
And so how long is it going to take, Jay, to scale? If we think how long it's taken to scale within fashion, but obviously that's kind of setting the foundations and getting the technology to work. I guess once that's working and people know about it, the opportunity to scale across all these other categories hopefully can happen quicker because the technology is there. It's then more about the input of new data, I guess, new materials, bill of materials, impact assessment.
Right. Yeah, materials are a big part of how we expand effectively, right? So that's a big part of it. But how long it will take, that's a very good question. If it was just me and the Worldly team driving this forward, I'm not sure how long it would take, but we've got Rick with us. and Rick has done this before.
He's a powerhouse.
Right. So that accelerates things because we don't have to figure it out from scratch. Rick actually convened a group of businesses in the apparel industry and has proven that it works. So that's a big accelerator for us. So I think that we have a real shot at seeing real expansion and adoption of more standards. And by the way, I'm not just talking about the Higg Index and SLCP, which Worldly aligns to because they are shared standards, but there are other great standards out there. I think we're going to start seeing more and more adoption of those standards. And what I care most about is just standardization, right? Obviously, I'm passionate about the Higg Index. I believe that's a great standard, but standardization in general matters. And the other thing I'll say is that right now, in this time we're all going through, where we're seeing a lot of pullback, one of the things we've observed at Worldly is a lot of public targets being quietly retired, right? We see the watering down of certain regulations that have been emerging. In the context of all that, I'm very optimistic for one specific reason, which is I see a lot of businesses, our customers at Worldly, moving towards a much more pragmatic approach to sustainability. So, the 2030 targets that were set might not all be met, but what is really good that's happening is broader ownership of sustainability within these brands and retailers, and it being linked to real pragmatic business outcomes around risk, business resilience and continuity, cost reduction. And I think that's what makes this durable, right? And makes it last. And that's being forced to happen right now. And it's happening. So I think that that's going to accelerate everything and make a lot of the work that's being done less vulnerable to economic and political cycles and even business cycles. And again, I'll point to the work that Rick has done throughout his career, pointing out that the smart thing and the right thing are not opposed, and they're often very well aligned. But we just need to do a lot of education.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you there. And even a conversation that I had this morning, people were saying, what's happening to the sustainability conversation? People don't care as much. And I said, well, people aren't shouting about it as much, but the work's being done. It's just been done with the departments, and it's been done as reducing risk as a business and building in efficiencies as a business. And, the rhetoric around it, the storytelling around it is different, but it's still there. And I think that we need this to be everyday business. We need it to be the way business is done and not something that's separate. And so I think the easier we can make that, the more that we intertwine it into business language, I think the more opportunity there is for us to do more.
That's right.
I'm very aware that I've taken up loads of your time today, but gosh, I could talk to you guys for hours. My last question to you both, and maybe Jay, will start with you, and then we'll come with you to end, if that's okay. So if we look 5 years into the future, what do you want it to look like 5 years? Because if we can see it and we can tell the story of it, we can build it.
Yeah. So 5 years in the future, I'll start by saying this. I think all of this stuff should be boring. I hope that it's boring, right? And when I say all of this stuff, what I mean is supply chain sustainability data. We're not still struggling to figure out how to get at it. We're not still struggling with figuring out how to create standards and get people to adopt those standards. It becomes foundational. It becomes expected. It's not the special project anymore. It's just there. And I think, one of the reasons why I want to see that happen, and the other thing I'll say is I want to see that data that suppliers and manufacturers provide flowing through all the jobs that need to get done where it's relevant. That's really critical, because what that will then drive, and this is what's most important to me, having worked so closely with so many of our manufacturer and supplier customers at Worldly, is in 5 years, ideally, we're seeing suppliers having to do a couple or at tops a few audits and assessments every year, so that they can focus on doing work that grows their business, but also work that reduces their impact. And every factory owner I've talked to has said that is a real issue for them. They cannot do both at the same time. They cannot be in 200 days of audits every year and drive impact reduction at the same time. So I want to see that happen. And I also want to see more economic upside for manufacturers and suppliers as well. It has to be there. They're doing all of the work. They're making all of the investments. That has to be there. And that can come in, there's many mechanisms for that to come, but it requires more collaboration and more community. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's access to capital at better terms, but also the big thing for suppliers will be, does performing well in sustainability drive more business for them? And the fact is that right now it really doesn't in most cases, unless they're working with a great brand like Patagonia or somebody similar. But for the most part, it doesn't right now. But that's beginning to change as brands and retailers are seeing the more pragmatic business outcomes that can come from doing the right things with their suppliers in the area of sustainability. So those are the big things I want to see. I want to see more economic upside, more adoption of standards. And again, not just the Higg Index, just suppliers doing fewer audits and assessments every year. And then, also, I think we have to see, frankly, fewer tools. There's a lot of innovation and all that's really exciting, but it's a lot of fragmentation, which is driving a lot of redundancy and a lot of inefficiency in the space. So, yeah.
I totally agree. I love that. And we've got a piece of work actually at the minute where we're saying, what are the brands asking for? What are the retailers asking for? We're mapping the whole thing. And we're saying, right, come on, there's got to be some efficiencies and some alignment within that. And I know I've been talking to Michael and the team on how we can share that data when it's done with you and the team. Thank you for that, Jay. And Rick, I know that, when the Sustainable Apparel Coalition started, there wasn't even that much life cycle assessment data. There wasn't a huge amount of data that connects. And now we're in a time, like Jay was saying, where people are asking to disclose this information. And how many times does a poor factory have to do another audit, fill in another piece of paper, or upload onto another platform? They are really struggling. But it's changed so much over those years from when it started. But if we go 5 years ahead, because hopefully we are picking up pace, what would you love to see, Rick?
Well, to build on what Jay said, I would like to see the continuation, acceleration of the expansion that's happening right now into other categories of consumer goods. Cascale, our sister organization, I told you earlier, that's why they rebranded their name. Wasn't going to work with apparel in their name. And that's happening. Just last year, they announced the acquisition of the Sustainable Furnishings Council. And I'm working closely with them now on that expansion into home and office furniture that Jay and his team is helping us with as well. I'd certainly like to see that continue. And then there's still a missing piece. It's still something we identified back in the very beginning. Those thinkers at MIT who were specialists on how to change big systems. Back then, they helped me recognize that we're only going to see the change that we really want to happen when the whole measurement system becomes fully transparent. And transparency is, we haven't achieved it to the degree we need to yet. It'll probably ultimately require some policy changes to mandate it. I recognize that. But I'm always advocating for that, because at the end of the day, with full transparency becomes full disclosure to to customers, and not B2B customers, to the consumers, even though I hate to use that word. All of us who buy stuff, all of us who are buying consumer goods, we need to be able to see those measurements and understand them easily. So I'd love to see that continue to head in that direction, to see it unfold within 5 years, so we can see by measurement what the impacts are of all the stuff that we surround our lives with. But then here's what I'd really like to see. This is the most important thing of all, that it's not the numbers that measure the impacts through the whole supply chain in all tiers of all the consumer goods that we use, but it's how we use those numbers to manage those impacts, to achieve that larger goal of year over year, reducing the environmental footprint and increasing the social justice of all the consumer goods with which we surround our lives. So that in aggregate, achieving those two things, we can then achieve the biggest goal of all. And that is changing the numbers that measure the health of our home planet. And I'm talking about the numbers that measure climate change, the numbers that measure freshwater eutrophication, that measure desertification, that measure deforestation, that measure ocean acidification. All those numbers are continuing to go in the wrong direction. And until we reverse those numbers, until we start bringing in better numbers there, we got to keep working hard. All of us have to keep using every tool that's in our box to make as much change as we can in the time that we have here on our one and only dear home planet.
I totally agree with you, Rick. And hopefully with digital product passports and EU regulation, it's a start, but we need so much more. And it's just been a real privilege to talk to you, Rick, and you, Jay, on both of your stories. And And hopefully there'll be people within our community that will listen to this, and next time they go into that meeting, they'll start to push for change, and that they'll come on that journey and do more, or start to share their stories, or the whole point of this is that we inspire a generation of people within industry to do the right thing. So huge thank you. I can't thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Helena.